A father said the German Shepherd was too big, too intense, too locked onto his daughter. He gave the dog 1 week to go. Then on day 5, the 130-pound dog slammed the 4-year-old to the ground. What the vet pulled from his jaws 3 hours later left the father on his knees, weeping in a hospital hallway. Before we go any further, welcome to our channel. If this is your first time here, you've arrived at exactly the right moment. Our team is pushing for 100 subscribers this month. Be a part of our journey for more thrilling updates. Rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments below and tell us, do you think Gregory was right to distrust Max? Because most people would have done exactly what he did. And that is the most uncomfortable part of this whole story. Now let's go back to the beginning. Gregory's jaw was set the moment he heard the truck pull into the driveway. He didn't move from where he stood at the kitchen counter, arms crossed, coffee going cold beside him, but his eyes tracked the sound the way they always tracked things he hadn't approved of. Measured, calculating, ready. He's only staying a couple of weeks, Sandra called from the hallway, smoothing her hair in the mirror. Gabriel is your oldest friend, Gregory. Just please try. Gregory said nothing. He walked to the front window and looked out. The truck was dusty from a long drive. Gabriel was already stepping out of the cab, grinning that easy grin Gregory had known since basic training, the grin that meant trust me on this one, and Gregory had learned, over 20 years of friendship, that grin was almost always followed by something he hadn't agreed to. Then the passenger door swung open. The dog stepped out like he owned whatever ground he was standing on. 130 pounds, easy, sable-coated, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a back as broad as a work table and legs that moved with the quiet, deliberate precision of an animal that had been trained not to waste a single step. His ears were erect, 2 sharp points aimed at the sky, and his eyes were a deep, clear amber, scanning the yard, the house, the tree line, the street, not nervous, not excited, just assessing. The way a soldier surveys new terrain before deciding it's safe enough to occupy. His name was Max, and Gregory did not want him anywhere near his daughter. 1 week, Gregory said, opening the front door before Gabriel could knock. That's what I told you on the phone. 1 week, Gabriel, and I meant it. Gabriel shook his hand with both of his, already steering him toward the truck with that grin working overtime. 1 week is plenty. Max is good, Greg. He's the best dog I've ever worked with, and you know I've worked with plenty. He's enormous, Gregory said flatly. He's disciplined. He's 130 pounds of teeth and military conditioning, and my daughter is 4 years old. Gabriel paused at that. His expression softened into something more careful. Greg, I know how you are. I know what you're thinking right now, but Max isn't what you're picturing in your head. He's not a weapon anymore. He's done. He just needs somewhere quiet and stable while I sort out my situation back home. Gregory looked at the dog. Max looked back at him, calm, unblinking, patient in the way that very large, very capable things sometimes are, not because they are harmless, but because they have nothing to prove. Gregory looked away first. Inside the house, he could hear the quick thunder of small feet on hardwood. Lily, 4 years old, blonde pigtails flying, barreling toward the front door the way she barreled toward everything in life. Without hesitation, without fear, without any concept that the world might occasionally give her a reason to slow down. Is the dog here? Daddy, is the dog here? She hit the screen door at full speed and burst through it before Gregory could redirect her. Sandra appeared in the hallway behind her, hands pressed together in that quiet, hopeful gesture Gregory recognized as please just let this be okay. Lily reached Max in about 4 seconds flat. She stopped just in front of him, chest heaving, eyes wide as dinner plates, and stared up at a dog who was, from her perspective, approximately the size of a small horse. Max lowered his head, slowly, deliberately, until his amber eyes were level with hers. They looked at each other for a long, still moment. The dog's nostrils worked quietly, reading everything about her, her shampoo, her breakfast, the grass on her shoes, her small, warm hands that were already reaching up to cup his muzzle with the fearless authority of a child who has never been told that some things are dangerous. Max led her. He held perfectly still while her tiny hands moved over his face. His tail gave one slow, measured sweep, not excitable, not frantic, just acknowledged. His name is Max, Lily announced to no one in particular, as if she had simply confirmed something she already knew. Gabriel laughed. Sandra pressed her fingers to her mouth. Gregory watched from the doorway with his arms crossed and felt, deep in his chest, the specific dread of a man whose objections are being quietly outvoted by people he loves. He gave it 1 week. 7 days for the dog to prove him wrong or prove him right. What Gregory didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing in that doorway watching his daughter hold a retired military dog's face in both her hands, was that Max had already made his own assessment, had already run his own calculation in those first 60 seconds in the yard. The child was small. The child was unguarded. The child moved through the world with the reckless, beautiful confidence of something that didn't yet know it could be hurt. Max had spent 6 years in service learning to identify exactly that, the unprotected thing, the vulnerable point, the gap in the perimeter. He would not leave a gap unguarded. From that first evening, he followed Lily, not in the frantic, desperate way of a dog seeking affection, but in the quiet, deliberate way of an escort, 3 steps behind her through the hallway, settled at the foot of her bed while she colored at her little table, lying outside the bathroom door while Sandra gave her a bath, head on his paws, ears rotating at every sound in the house. When she slept, he slept outside her door. When she woke, he was already standing. Gregory watched all of it and felt the knot in his chest pulled tighter with every hour. He had read about this. He had looked it up because Gregory looked everything up, researched every risk, calculated every variable, and what he found did not reassure him. German shepherds, high prey drive, powerful bite force, unpredictable under stress, articles with photographs of emergency rooms, headlines in bold black type that sat behind his eyes even when he wasn't looking at a screen. He's fixated on her, Gregory said one night, his voice low so Lily wouldn't hear him from down the hall. He was standing at the kitchen window, watching Max's silhouette through the glass, the dog, as always, positioned between the house and the yard, facing outward. That's not normal, Sandra, that intensity, that stare. Sandra set down the dish she was drying and came to stand beside him. He's watching the yard, she said quietly, not Lily, the yard. He watches her constantly. He watches everything. She put her hand on his arm. Gabriel said he was trained for exactly this, family protection. This is what he does. Gabriel isn't here, Gregory said. We are. He called Gabriel that night anyway. Your dog won't leave Lily alone. There was a pause on the other end. Then, define alone. He follows her everywhere, sits outside her room, won't take his eyes off her. Another pause, longer this time. Gabriel said, and his voice had shifted into something careful. That's not a warning sign. That's a working dog doing his job. He's decided she's his responsibility. She is not his responsibility, Gregory said, his voice dropping to the register it went to when he was done negotiating. She is my responsibility, and that dog goes at the end of the week. He hung up before Gabriel could answer. Down the hall, in the pale yellow glow of a nightlight shaped like a star, Lily was asleep. Her arm was draped over the edge of the bed, fingers trailing toward the floor. Just below her fingertips, Max lay in the hallway, head on his paws, eyes open in the dark. Watching the door. Watching the window. Watching everything Gregory couldn't see. Day 1 passed. Day 2. Day 3, Lily fell asleep against his flank in the afternoon sunlight, one small hand curled deep in his fur, and Sandra stood in the living room doorway with tears she didn't let Gregory see. Day 4, Gregory almost called Gabriel twice and stopped himself both times because he wasn't wrong, he told himself. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. He was a father, fear was the job. Day 5 arrived the way terrible days sometimes do, bright, ordinary, smelling of cut grass and warm afternoon air. Lily was in the backyard. Max was on the patio. Gregory was at the kitchen window, watching. He noticed later that he was always at the kitchen window, always watching. And yet somehow, for all his vigilance, for all his monitoring and calculating and preparing, he was the last one in that yard to see what was coming. Max saw it first. His head came up from his paws. His ears, which had been relaxed, snapped forward. His amber eyes locked onto the far tree line, and something changed in his body, a shift so total, so instantaneous, it was like watching a switch thrown in a machine. Every muscle in his 130-pound frame went to stone. His gaze didn't move, not to Gregory, not to Sandra, not to Lily, who was 20 feet away, laughing to herself, chasing a yellow ball through the long grass near the back fence, completely unaware that anything in the world had changed. Gregory saw none of this. He saw only what came next. Max left the patio like a thing launched from a cannon. No bark, no warning, no sound at all, just 130 pounds of pure focus speed exploding across the yard in absolute silence, straight toward his daughter. The coffee mug hit the floor before Gregory knew he'd dropped it. Lily! He was already running, hitting the back door at full speed, his heart detonating in his chest. But he was too far. He was always going to be too far. Max reached Lily in 4 strides. The impact was enormous, a wall of muscle slamming into her small body, driving her sideways and down into the grass. She screamed, a sound that tore straight through Gregory's chest. Max didn't stop. He drove his body over hers, pressing her flat, his head wrenching violently to the side, jaws wide, teeth flashing in the afternoon light, snarling in a way Gregory had never heard from any animal, a deep, tearing, guttural sound that turned his blood cold. Gregory hit the yard running. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. His hands were already reaching. Get off her! He grabbed the collar with both hands and pulled with everything in him. The dog fought him, muscles locked, body rigid, a force Gregory hadn't believed was possible in any animal. He yanked again, harder, his boots sliding in the grass, and Max finally released, staggering back, shaking his head violently, making a terrible, wet, choking sound. Gregory threw himself between the dog and his daughter. Sandra was already there, scooping Lily from the grass, turning her over, hands moving frantically across her arms, her legs, her neck, her face. Is she hurt, Sandra, is she? She's not, Sandra said, her voice shaking but certain. Gregory, she's not hurt, there's not a mark on her. Gregory turned. Max was standing 10 feet away, staggering, his head hung low, his chest, his neck, his jowl torn open. Something had bitten him, more than once, more than twice. The wounds were deep and wet, and blood was already darkening the grass beneath him. The dog's legs buckled. He went down sideways, his breath coming in ragged, wet pulls. His eyes moved just once, scanning until they found Lily, safe in Sandra's arms, unhurt, crying from the shock of it. When Max found her, something shifted in his gaze. The muscles in his face released. His tail moved, once barely. Then his eyes closed. Gregory looked at the grass where Max had been fighting. Something was there, half hidden in the long blades, gray, still, heavy with wounds. His hands had stopped shaking. A different feeling had taken their place entirely, not rage, not fear, but something cold and nameless that he had no language for yet. Get in the car, he said. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Sandra, get Lily in the car now. He bent down and wrapped his arms around the dog that he had spent 5 days trying to remove from his home, and he lifted him the way he would carry something irreplaceable, something he had almost thrown away without understanding its worth. He didn't know that yet. He would know it in 3 hours. But first there was a drive, and a clinic, and a vet named Miss Jean who would walk out of a trauma room carrying a metal tray and speak 4 words that would bring Gregory, broad-shouldered, iron-jawed, always watching Gregory, to his knees on a hospital hallway floor. "Your dog saved her. Don't go anywhere." What Miss Jean found in Max's jaws is something Gregory will never forget, and neither will you. The truck needed a wash. That was the first thing Gregory noticed, the grey film of highway dust coating the wheel wells, the windshield carrying the kind of splattered mileage that said this vehicle had been driven hard and far, and without much thought for appearances. It turned into the driveway at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and Gregory was already at the front door before the engine cut out, because Gregory was always already somewhere before anyone else arrived. That was the kind of man he was. He got there first, he assessed, he decided. He had already decided about the dog. Gabriel swung out of the cab looking like a man who had driven 9 hours on 3 hours of sleep and was choosing, deliberately and with great effort, to appear unbothered by this. He was Gregory's oldest friend, had been since the kind of shared hardship that forges bonds you can't manufacture in ordinary life, and Gregory recognized every tell, the looseness in his shoulders that was actually tension, the easy smile working slightly too hard. Gabriel needed something, and he needed Gregory not to say no, and he was hopping 9 hours of highway between them, and whatever situation he'd left behind might have softened the ground a little. It hadn't, but it was the passenger seat that held Gregory's attention now. The dog hadn't moved when the engine stopped, hadn't lurched toward the window or pawed at the door the way Gregory had half expected, some excitable, overwhelming animal spilling out of the cab before Gabriel could even reach the handle. Instead, Max sat exactly as he'd apparently been sitting for however many hours of that drive, his broad chest forward, his ears up and aimed at the house like two radar dishes calibrating on a new signal. His amber eyes moved across the driveway, the front face of the house, the yard to the left, the yard to the right, measuring, filing. Then he looked directly at Gregory. It lasted only a second, but it was the kind of second that had weight to it, the kind of look that wasn't curiosity and wasn't aggression and wasn't the vacant, eager blinking of a family pet. It was assessment, pure and quiet, and Gregory had the unsettling experience of feeling, for just a moment, like the one being evaluated. He kept his arms crossed and his expression flat. Gabriel reached the door with his hand out. "Greg, you look good, man. You look like you drove all night." Most of it. Gabriel shook his hand, held it, the grip of someone who was also communicating please. "He's good in the car," didn't make a sound the whole way. "How long?" Gabriel exhaled through his nose. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I've got to get back to sort things out with Donna's estate, and the lawyers are, it's a whole thing, Greg. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. You said 2 weeks on the phone. You also said 1 on the phone before that. I know what I said. 1 week, Gregory told him. I'll give you 1 week, and if anything. The screen door burst open. Lily hit the porch at a dead sprint, pigtails horizontal with her own velocity, arms already reaching for something she hadn't even fully seen yet, but had decided, somewhere between the kitchen and the front door, was going to be wonderful. She was 4 years old, and she had not yet developed any reliable instinct for caution, and Gregory, sometimes, felt this was going to be the end of him. Is he here? Is the dog here? She'd seen the truck. She'd seen the shape in the passenger seat. And now she was already past Gregory, already past Gabriel, already at the truck's passenger door with her palms flat against the glass, peering in at 130 pounds of retired military animal with the fearless certainty of a child who has never once been let down by the world and doesn't yet know she should prepare for the possibility. Gabriel reached past her and opened the door. Max stepped down from the cab the way he'd looked at the house, deliberately, without rush, each paw placed with a quiet assurance that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with a lifetime of training that had made careless movement feel foreign to him. He was enormous up close, sable coat running dark across his back and shoulders and fading to a warm tan at his chest and legs, the fur thick and dense. His head came level with Lily's face when he dropped it to look at her. And even then, he was broad enough that the sight of him should have given a 4-year-old pause. It didn't give Lily any pause at all. She put both hands on either side of his face immediately, the way she held things she decided belonged to her. Max went still. He didn't pull back, didn't stiffen. He simply held the position and let her small hands move over the bridge of his nose and behind his ears, his nostrils working in slow, careful pulls, reading her the way he'd been trained to read environments, thoroughly, without reaction, storing every detail. After a moment, his tail made one long, slow arc, not the frantic wag of a dog performing happiness, something measured, something more like acknowledgement. "His name is Max," Lily said, with the authority of someone filing a document. From the porch, Sandra watched with her hands folded under her chin, and Gregory recognized the expression on her face, the one she wore when she believed something was already decided and was simply waiting for him to catch up. He didn't say anything. Gabriel clapped him once on the shoulder as he passed. "1 week, Greg, I'll make it work." Gregory watched his daughter and the dog that he had not asked for and did not want and could not, in this moment, bring himself to physically remove from his driveway. He had been a soldier. He knew the difference between a threat and a weapon at rest. He told himself that distinction didn't apply here. He was wrong, but it would take 5 more days and a moment of violence that wasn't violence at all before he would understand exactly how wrong he had been and what that wrongness had almost cost him. The lesson of every day we spend afraid of the wrong thing is the same. While our eyes are fixed on the danger we invented, the real one moves quietly through the grass. Max knew this. Gregory would learn it the hard way. Gabriel had left a folder on the kitchen counter before he drove away. Gregory noticed it the same way he noticed everything Gabriel did that was calculated to appear casual, too deliberately placed, too neatly squared against the edge of the counter to have been set down without thought. He left it there for 2 days without opening it. Sandra opened it on the second evening, while Gregory was in the backyard pretending to check on the garden and actually watching the dog through the fence. She read it quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and when Gregory came back inside, she didn't say anything, just closed the folder and slid it across the counter toward him with one finger, the way you slide something to a person you know needs to discover it on their own terms. He read it that night after Lily was asleep. Max's full name, in the official records, was K9 Maximilian, designated MWD, military working dog, trained through the Department of Defense's program at Lackland Air Force Base, beginning at 8 weeks old. The folder held a service summary, a behavioral evaluation, a handler transfer document signed by Gabriel, and a short letter from Max's last official military handler, a man named Sergeant Cole, that Gregory read 3 times before he put it down. The summary was dry and procedural, the way military documents always are, all metrics and dates and performance indicators, but the shape of a life was still visible underneath the bureaucratic language if you knew how to read it. 8 weeks old when his training began, 14 months before his first deployment. 2 full overseas rotations across 7 years of service, the kind of environments where the difference between a dog performing adequately and a dog performing with genuine precision was sometimes the difference between a team coming home and a team not coming home. He had cleared buildings that humans couldn't safely enter. He had moved through darkness and rubble and chemical residue and found things and people that no equipment had been able to locate. He had walked point on patrols in conditions that broke equipment and bent men, and he had not broken and he had not bent. But it was Sergeant Cole's letter that Gregory kept returning to. Cole had written it by hand, which was unusual, and the handwriting had the particular controlled messiness of a person writing quickly because they had too much to say and were trying to discipline themselves to say only what mattered. He described Max the way soldiers sometimes describe the best people they've served with, not with sentimentality, but with a specific kind of respect that is harder to earn and means more than affection. He wrote that in 6 years of working dogs, Max was the only animal he had encountered that seemed to operate on something beyond conditioning. That training could produce obedience, and good training could produce reliability, but what Max had was something Cole couldn't fully account for. He anticipated. He read situations before they developed. There were 3 specific incidents Cole cited. moments where Max had reacted to a threat before any human member of the team was aware one existed, where his response time had preceded the stimulus rather than followed it, where the dog had made what Cole could only call a decision rather than executing a response. He doesn't just follow the mission, Cole had written near the end. He understands it. I've never said that about an animal before, and I'm aware how it sounds. But anyone who worked alongside him for more than a week knew what I'm talking about. He has a sense of what he's protecting and why, and that sense doesn't switch off. Gregory set the letter down. Through the hallway, through the closed door of Lily's room, he could hear the specific quality of silence that meant she was deeply asleep, the settled, untroubled quiet of a child who feels completely safe. And just outside that door, if he walked down the hall and looked, he already knew what he would find. He'd checked twice since coming inside. Max on the floor, head on his paws, eyes open in the dark. Not restless, not anxious. Just present, in the way of something that has been given a post and intends to hold it. What Gregory didn't know, what the folder couldn't tell him, because no document records the interior life of an animal, was what Max had understood the moment Lily put her hands on his face in that driveway. Dogs bred and trained for protection work don't assign that role randomly. They evaluate. They process the information their senses gather, and they make something that functions very much like a judgment. And Max, with his military-honed instincts reading the small girl who had no fear of him, who smelled of grass and something sweet, and who touched his face with the unguarded trust of a creature that didn't yet know the world required caution. Max had made his judgment in under a minute. She was not a threat, she was a vulnerability, and in the framework that 7 years of service had built into the architecture of his understanding, a vulnerability was something you positioned yourself around, something you placed yourself between and whatever the darkness might send out of the tree line. He had done it without being asked, without a command, without a handler, without a protocol, because Sergeant Cole had been right, the sense of what he was protecting and why didn't switch off. It had simply, in the absence of war, found a new assignment. Gregory folded the letter and placed it back in the folder. He sat with it for a long time in the kitchen light while the house breathed around him, and he felt something shift beneath the floor of his certainty, not collapse, not yet, but a hairline fault opening in the foundation. He told himself it didn't change anything. The dog was still enormous, still trained for combat, still a variable he hadn't chosen and couldn't control. He told himself that. But he left the folder on the counter where he could find it again. A tool built for protection doesn't become dangerous by existing. It becomes dangerous when the wrong person decides what it is before they understand what it does. The greatest disservice we pay to loyalty is calling it a threat because it doesn't look the way we expected love to look. It started the morning after Gabriel left, before the house had fully woken up. Gregory was the first one downstairs, as always, coffee brewing, the back door checked, the day organized in his mind before anyone else had opened their eyes. Max had spent the night in the hallway outside Lily's door, which Gregory had discovered at midnight when he'd gotten up for water and nearly stepped on him. He'd stood there in the dark for a moment, looking down at the dog, and Max had looked back up at him with those amber eyes that caught the nightlight's glow and said nothing and moved nothing except his eyebrows, tracking Gregory with an alertness that seemed unreasonable for an animal that should, by any logic, have been sleeping. Gregory had gone back to bed and lain there for a while, staring at the ceiling. Now in the grey of early morning, he stood at the counter with his coffee and watched Max come downstairs behind Lily, who had apparently materialized in the hallway at some point without Gregory hearing her, which was a thing that happened when you had a 4-year-old and was supposed to be charming, and instead only reminded Gregory that a small child could move through a house undetected, that the distance between safe and not safe was sometimes just a matter of who was paying attention. Max was paying attention. He came down the stairs 2 steps behind her, matching her pace, which was unhurried and winding, the way Lily's pace always was, pausing on the 3rd step to examine something on the wall, pausing again at the bottom to adjust the sock that had bunched under her heel. Max stopped when she stopped, moved when she moved, not hovering, not pressing against her, but maintaining a distance that had the quality of a decision, close enough, and no closer, and not an inch further back than necessary. Lily was entirely unaware of this. She padded into the kitchen, climbed into her chair, and began negotiating for cereal with the focused energy of someone who had been thinking about cereal since approximately 4 in the morning. Max settled himself at the edge of the kitchen, his back to the counter, his face to the room. His eyes moved to the back door, to the window above the sink, to Lily, to Gregory, to the window again. A patrol. A quiet, continuous, methodical patrol that happened to be located inside a house. Gregory drank his coffee and watched, and said nothing. By midday he had mapped the pattern. Max did not follow Lily in the way of a dog seeking warmth or company or the possibility of dropped food. He followed her the way a detail follows a protectee, always oriented slightly outward, always more interested in what surrounded her than in her directly, turning his attention to her only to confirm her position before returning it to whatever perimeter he had defined in his mind. When she moved to the living room, he moved to the living room and placed himself between her and the front window. When she went upstairs for her afternoon nap, he went with her and took up his position at the foot of her bed, and when Gregory looked in 10 minutes later, Max's eyes were not on Lily sleeping peacefully under her blanket, they were on the window. Gregory pulled the door mostly shut and stood in the hallway and breathed. He called Gabriel at 3 o'clock. "Your dog won't leave Lily alone." The pause on Gabriel's end was brief but specific, the pause of a man choosing his words rather than reaching for them. "What do you mean, won't leave her alone?" "He follows her everywhere, room to room, up the stairs, outside if Sandra takes her to the porch. He sits outside her door at night. He watches her." Gregory paused. "He watches everything around her, constantly. I can't tell if he's—" He stopped, because saying it out loud felt both necessary and absurd. "If he's what?" "I can't tell if he's protective or fixated, Gabriel. There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. "Greg. Don't. He's doing his job. She's a 4-year-old in a house in the suburbs. She doesn't need." "He doesn't know that." Gabriel's voice was patient in the way of someone who has had a version of this conversation before and lost it and learned from losing it. "Greg, listen to me. Max spent 7 years learning to identify the most vulnerable person in any environment and position himself as the variable between that person and whatever threat existed. That's not a behavior you retire. That's not something you untrain. It's not even something you'd want to untrain." He looked at Lily and he made a decision. That decision is not going to change. "I don't want him making decisions about my daughter." "He already did," Gabriel said quietly, "and the decision he made was that she matters, that she's worth protecting." A beat. "You're going to tell me that's the wrong call?" Gregory said nothing. "One more week, Greg, just watch him. Actually watch him, not the way you're watching him now, looking for the thing that goes wrong. Watch what he's actually doing." Gregory hung up and stood in the kitchen and looked through the window at the backyard where Sandra had taken Lily after her nap, the two of them in the afternoon light, Sandra pushing her gently on the small swing they'd hung from the oak tree. Max was on the grass 10 feet back, facing the fence line. His ears were moving independently, rotating like instruments, gathering information from every direction. His body was still. His eyes were on the spaces between things. He didn't look like a threat. Gregory needed him to look like a threat, because if he didn't, if that watchfulness was exactly what Gabriel said it was, then the discomfort Gregory had been carrying since the truck pulled into his driveway wasn't really about the dog at all. It was about a father who had decided he was the only one capable of keeping his daughter safe, confronted suddenly with a protector he hadn't chosen and couldn't control, and could not, if he was being completely honest with himself, find a single, objective reason to remove. Outside, Lily laughed at something. Her laughter carried through the glass, bright and uncomplicated. Max's ears lifted toward the sound, just slightly, the way they did, Gregory had noticed, every single time. Gregory saw a threat where there was a guardian. And the scary part, most of us would have seen exactly the same thing. If you're watching this and you know, honestly know, you would have done what Gregory did, drop a paw prints in the comments right now. And if you think Gregory's fear was the real villain in this story, hit that like button, because what's coming is about to prove you right in the most heartbreaking way possible. Day 3 arrived quietly, the way the middle days of any week do, without announcement, without the weight of beginning or the pressure of ending, just ordinary hours stacked against each other in the particular rhythm of a house with a small child in it. Max had established his routines by then, and the household had begun, almost without noticing, to organize itself around them. Sandra had stopped flinching when she turned a corner and found him there. Lily had stopped announcing his presence with the excitement of novelty and had begun simply accepting it, the way children accept the furniture as part of the permanent shape of things. Gregory had not reached either of these places, but he had achieved a taut, watchful coexistence, the kind that requires constant, quiet effort and leaves you tired in the evenings without being able to say exactly why. He was tired on day 3. He'd come in from work at 5:30 to find the living room in the specific state of late afternoon entropy that Lily generated wherever she went. Picture books splayed open on the rug, a collection of small plastic animals arranged in a circle of apparent significance, one shoe inexplicably on the coffee table. Max was in his usual position near the window, sphinx-like, observing. Lily was somewhere upstairs with Sandra. The house was calm. Gregory made himself a coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the dog do nothing threatening for 11 minutes. It was around 6 when he heard Lily come back downstairs, and he tracked her progress through the house by sound, the particular rhythm of her footsteps, the brief pause, then a rustling sound from the living room that he couldn't immediately identify. He walked to the doorway. Lily was on her tiptoes beside Max, who had apparently at some point shifted from his alert position to lying on his side, the first time Gregory had seen him fully horizontal during waking hours, with his eyes half closed and his breathing slow. She was holding the small blanket she carried everywhere, the one with the faded yellow stars that she'd had since she was a baby, and with enormous seriousness and considerable effort, she was draping it across Max's back. She smoothed it with both palms, pressing out the wrinkles, tucking the corner under his flank with the focused care of someone who has watched adults make beds and has decided this is how you show something that you value its comfort. She stepped back and assessed her work, then leaned forward and adjusted the corner she'd tucked. Satisfied, she nodded once. Max hadn't moved, not when she'd approached, not when her small hands had pressed and smoothed across his back, not when she'd leaned her weight briefly against his side to reach the far edge of the blanket. He lay there breathing slowly under a blanket patterned with yellow stars, and accepted it with the absolute stillness of an animal that understands that sometimes the kindest response to being loved is simply to hold still and let it happen. Gregory stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. He told himself later it was because he didn't want to startle Lily. That was partly true. The following afternoon, day 4, he came home to silence, which in a house containing Lily was unusual enough to walk quickly through, checking rooms. He found them in the living room. Sandra was in the armchair with a book open in her lap. Though she wasn't reading it, she was watching the cooch, or rather, watching what was beside the cooch, the way you watch something you don't want to disturb by looking at it too directly. Lily had fallen asleep on the floor. She was curled against Max's flank, her back against his ribs, her knees drawn up. One small hand disappeared entirely into the thick fur of his shoulder. Her mouth was slightly open, and her breathing was the deep, unhurried breathing of a child who is completely, unconditionally comfortable. The yellow star blanket was tucked around her, though Gregory had not seen Lily put it there, and suspected, from the angle and the neatness of it, that Sandra had arranged it quietly, not wanting to wake her. Max was awake. He looked up when Gregory came in, met his eyes across the room with that same steady amber gaze that gave nothing away and concealed nothing either, and then looked at Sandra, and then back down at Lily. His body hadn't shifted. His breathing was measured and slow, calibrated, it seemed, to not disturb the child pressed against him. He was warm, Gregory realized distantly. That was why she'd found him. 130 pounds of dense muscle and thick fur, radiating warmth like a furnace, and she had simply located the warmest place in the room and trusted it completely. Sandra looked up at Gregory with an expression that said please and I know, and just look at it all at once, without saying any of those things. Gregory crossed the room and crouched down and touched Lily's shoulder. Hey, sweetheart, let's get you to the couch. Lily surfaced slowly, blinking, and reached without thinking for Gregory's neck, and he lifted her and held her against his chest and felt, as he always did when he held her sleeping weight, the specific terror of loving something this much. He settled her on the couch and pulled the blanket up and smoothed her hair back and straightened up. Max was watching him. Not with challenge, not with the stiffened posture and direct stare of an animal asserting ownership or preparing to dispute a decision. Just watching patient level with those unreadable amber eyes that Gregory was beginning to suspect were not unreadable at all, but were in fact reading him. Taking Gregory's measure with the same quiet precision he applied to everything else in his environment. Gregory waited for the growl that didn't come, the posturing that didn't happen, some signal, any signal, that would confirm what he needed to believe about this animal. Max simply waited. It was, Gregory would think later, the most unsettling thing the dog had done all week. Not the following, not the watching, not the stillness at the foot of Lily's bed. This, the patience of a creature that had already made its decision and felt no need to defend or explain it, that could absorb Gregory's distrust without reacting to it, that understood, in whatever way an animal understands anything, that the man standing over him was afraid, and chose, deliberately, not to make it worse. Gregory pulled Lily's blanket straight and left the room. He didn't look back. He should have. The love that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up, holds still, and stays, is often the love we're most at risk of pushing away. We distrust it because it doesn't need us to believe in it. It protects us whether we deserve it or not. And sometimes, the cruelest thing fear does is make us call that kind of love dangerous. Day 5 had the particular quality of days that later become fixed in memory, not for what they announced, but for what they concealed. An ordinary afternoon wearing its ordinariness like a disguise, bright and warm and unhurried, giving nothing away. Sandra had opened the back door after lunch to let Lily burn off the restless energy that accumulated in her like static charge when she'd been inside too long. The yard was warm, the grass still green from the rain 2 days earlier, and Lily went through the door at her usual velocity, already scanning for the yellow ball she'd left near the flower bed, already in motion before her feet had fully committed to the ground beneath them. Max followed her out and took up his position on the patio, lowering himself onto the warm concrete with the unhurried deliberateness that had become familiar, his head up, his eyes on the yard. Gregory was at the kitchen window. He had told himself and told Sandra that he was not monitoring the dog. He was making a second cup of coffee and the window happened to face the backyard and he happened to be standing near it. Sandra had said nothing to this, which was its own kind of response. She had taken the laundry basket to the far end of the kitchen table and begun folding, her back partially to the window, trusting in the afternoon the way Gregory had never quite learned to trust in anything. Lily found the ball and the next 30 minutes were placid and unremarkable. She bounced it against the fence. She rolled it down the slight incline of the yard and chased it. She had a brief, apparently significant conversation with a beetle she found near the garden bed, during which the ball was set aside and recovered and set aside again. She drifted, the way children drift in open spaces, without agenda, without destination, pulled by whatever happened to catch her attention next. She moved closer to the back fence as the afternoon stretched. Gregory noted this without moving. The fence was solid 6 feet of timber, latched gate on the far side. The tree line beyond it was maybe 20 feet past that, a ragged border of oak and scrub where their property gave way to the undeveloped land that backed onto the neighborhood. He had always considered it an asset, that buffer of trees, privacy, natural boundary. He had never once considered what might move through it. Max had been still for the better part of half an hour. Then he wasn't. The change moved through his body the way a current moves through a wire, invisible in its cause, total in its effect. Gregory wasn't watching him, and so he didn't see it. The way Max's head came off his paws and dropped low rather than lifting, nose angled toward the fence line, nostrils working fast and shallow. The way his ears, which had been relaxed and rotating slowly, went suddenly rigid and forward, aimed at a fixed point in the tree line beyond the fence, with the precision of instruments locking onto a signal. The way his weight shifted from resting to loaded, not standing, not yet, but coiled, every muscle in his hindquarters and shoulders drawing inward and downward like a spring being compressed by degrees. His eyes found the gap between the third and fourth fence slats from the left. They did not move from it. Lily was 12 feet from the fence, still talking to herself, bouncing the ball off the timber with a hollow thump that rang out in the afternoon air at irregular intervals. She had not looked toward the tree line. She had no reason to. Gregory was watching her. He saw none of what was happening on the patio. He saw only when Max moved. The launch was so sudden and so total that Gregory's mind could not initially construct a cause for it. One moment the dog was on the patio, and the next he was simply gone from it, already in the air, already covering the first 10 feet of grass before Gregory's brain had even registered the motion as intentional. There was no bark, no growl, no warning sound of any kind. Just 130 pounds of muscle and speed moving in absolute silence across the yard, in a straight line aimed directly at his daughter. The sound Gregory made was not a word. It tore out of him before thought, raw and desperate. Lily's name detonated from somewhere beneath language, from the place where fathers keep the fear they never speak. He hit the back door at a run, his shoulder catching the frame, barely feeling it, already in the yard, already running with everything he had, knowing even as he ran that he was too far and too slow, and that the arithmetic of distance and speed had already concluded without him. Max reached Lily in 4 strides. The impact was enormous. His chest and shoulder connected with her small body and drove her sideways off her feet and down into the grass in a single savage motion. And Lily's scream pierced the afternoon like something breaking. Max didn't stop at the collision. He drove his body over hers, covering her, his weight pinning her into the grass, and then his head wrenched hard to the left, jaws crashing together on something Gregory couldn't yet see, and the sound that came from his chest was a sound Gregory had not heard an animal make outside of a nature documentary, deep and tearing and absolute, a sound built for exactly one purpose. Gregory hit the grass at full speed, still screaming. His hands found the collar. Both hands, every gram of strength he had, and he pulled, and the dog resisted him with a force that was genuinely shocking, that made Gregory's boots slide in the grass, that told him in one terrible physical instant exactly how much of Max's capability had been held carefully in reserve during 5 days of patient, quiet coexistence. He pulled again, harder. His vision was narrowed to a point. Max released. He staggered back, head still moving, making a wet and labored sound now, and Gregory threw himself down in the grass between the dog and his daughter and gathered her up with shaking hands. Sandra was already there. Her hands moved across Lily with the focused speed of a mother running a damage assessment, arms, legs, neck, face, the back of her head, and Gregory watched her face for the confirmation of his worst fear and instead saw something else move across it. Confusion, then relief so acute it looked almost like grief. She looked up at him. "She's not hurt." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Gregory, not a scratch, she's not hurt." The world lurched. Gregory turned toward Max. The dog was on the grass 4 feet away, and the sight of him reordered everything. He was not postured. He was not advancing. He was barely standing, his legs trembling, his head hanging low, his chest and neck running with blood from wounds that were deep and fresh and numerous, the dark fur matted and wet across his shoulder and jaw and the thick column of his throat. He was making a sound with each breath that was effortful and wrong, and even as Gregory watched, his legs began to buckle. But his eyes moved first. They found Lily in Sandra's arms, crying but unmarked and breathing. They held there for a moment, those amber eyes, steady even now, even in this, and something in Max's face changed in a way that Gregory had no vocabulary for. Not relief exactly, something more fundamental than relief. the expression of an animal that has completed the thing it was made to do and can now, finally, afford to stop. His legs gave out. He went down onto his side and lay in the grass, breathing in shallow pulls, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Gregory had ever heard. In the grass near the fence line, half concealed by shadow, something lay that Gregory had not yet looked at directly. Grey, still, heavy with wounds that matched, precisely, the ones now bleeding quietly from the dog who had just spent the last 30 seconds being called a monster in Gregory's mind. We spend so much time guarding against the threats we can imagine that we leave ourselves completely open to the ones we never pictured. Fear makes us watchers. Love, real love, trained and instinctive and total, makes you move before the watching can even begin. The first thing Gregory understood was that his hands were shaking. Not the way hands shake from cold or from exertion, from something deeper, something the body does when it has processed a terror so complete that the adrenaline has nowhere left to go and simply vibrates in the muscles like current with no ground. He was kneeling in the grass, and he didn't remember kneeling. He was looking at Lily and Sandra and the specific quality of Sandra's movements, fast, methodical, the controlled urgency of a woman checking every inch of her daughter's body, and he was waiting. That was all he was doing, waiting for Sandra's face to confirm the thing he already believed had happened. She checked Lily's arms first, both of them turning them over in her hands, running her fingers from shoulder to wrist, then her legs, pulling up the hem of her dress, examining both knees, both shins, the soft skin behind each knee where a bite would have gone deep. Then her neck, tilting her chin up, turning her head gently left and then right. Then her face, palms cupping Lily's cheeks, thumbs moving across her jaw, her temples, her hairline. Sandra's hands stopped. She looked up at Gregory. "She's not hurt." The words came out stripped of everything except the fact of them. No relief yet, no color, just the raw information, delivered with the precision of someone who understood that Gregory needed the truth in the simplest possible form before he could process anything else. Not a scratch on her. "Gregory, she's not hurt." Lily was crying the way children cry when they've been frightened by something they don't have the framework to explain, not the sharp, immediate cry of pain, but something more bewildered, the tears of a small person whose world has moved without warning and hasn't yet settled back into recognizable shapes. She pressed her face into Sandra's neck and held on with both hands and cried in heaving, shuddering pulls, and Sandra held her and rocked her, and Gregory sat in the grass beside them and understood very slowly that his daughter did not have a mark on her. The shift that moved through him then was not relief. Relief was too simple a word for something that complex, the simultaneous unwinding of a terror and the arrival of a confusion so profound it felt, for a moment, like a different kind of fear. If she wasn't hurt, then what had happened? If the blood wasn't hers, then? He turned toward Max. He would think about this moment for the rest of his life. The way understanding arrives not all at once, but in pieces, each one rearranging what came before it, the picture assembling itself in real time while you stand there watching. Max was on his feet, but barely. His legs were trembling in the fine, continuous way that spoke of a body drawing on reserves it had already depleted, the last efforts of an engine running past empty. His head was low, hanging between his shoulders, and his breathing was the wrong kind of breathing, the kind with labor in it, with a wetness underneath each exhale that shouldn't have been there. His coat, which had been thick and sable and pristine that morning, was matted across his chest, and neck and jaw, dark and heavy with blood that had already begun to dry at the edges, and was still welling fresh at the center of the wounds. Gregory looked at the wounds. Something had bitten Max, not once, many times with intent, with the frantic concentrated force of an animal fighting for its life. The punctures on his neck were deep, grouped close together the way they are when jaws clench and hold and clench again. The gashes across his jowl were ragged, the kind that come from movement, from a head wrenching in one direction while teeth maintain their grip in another. His chest was torn in two places, lower down, defensive wounds from an animal that had gone for the underside when the throat was too well defended. Whatever Max had fought, it had fought back hard. His legs buckled at the knees first, then the hindquarters, and he went down sideways into the grass the way very large things fall, with a weight and a finality that made the ground feel it. He lay on his side, and his ribs expanded and contracted with the effort of each breath, and the sound of it carried across the quiet yard, ragged and irregular, a machine running wrong. But his eyes were still moving. They traveled across the yard with the last of whatever he had left, past Gregory, past Sandra, past the fence line he had been watching for 5 days, and they found Lily, in Sandra's arms, crying but whole, unmarked, breathing. Max's eyes held there. Something moved across his face that Gregory had no language for and would spend months trying to describe to people who hadn't seen it. Not peace exactly, something more earned than peace. The expression of a soldier who has held the line and can see, from where he's fallen, that the thing he was holding it for is still standing. His ribs continued their labored work. His legs had stopped trembling because they had stopped trying. But his gaze stayed on Lily with a steadiness that the rest of his body could no longer manage, and it stayed there until his eyes finally closed. Gregory looked at the grass beyond, where Max had fallen. He had to look twice. It was half in shadow, tucked against the base of the fence where the long grass grew thickest, and it had the limpness of a thing entirely without tension. Gray-furred, heavy-bodied, its mouth was open. Its legs were angled in the way of something that had not chosen its final position. The wounds on it were numerous and decisive. And they matched. Gregory understood this even before his mind had fully formed the thought. They matched exactly the movement he had seen when he'd grabbed Max's collar and the dog had wrenched his head to the side, jaws working, snarling at something in the grass that Gregory had been too consumed by fear to see clearly. He stared at it for a long time. A coyote, adult, heavily built, stone dead in his backyard 4 feet from where his daughter had been playing. Gregory put both hands flat on the grass in front of him and bent forward and breathed. Behind him, Sandra was already on her feet, already making the calculation he hadn't caught up to yet. "I'll get the car," she said quietly. "Gregory, we have to get him there now." Gregory pushed himself upright. His legs felt wrong beneath him, unfamiliar, like borrowed equipment. He looked at Max on the grass, at the blood, at the slow, terrible rise and fall of his ribs, and something moved through him that was nothing like what he'd felt for the past 5 days. Nothing like fear, nothing like control or calculation or the management of variables. He bent down. He got his arms under Max, all 130 pounds of him, all that dense and damaged weight, and he lifted him the way you lift something you have just realized you almost threw away. Imperfectly, with effort, with both hands doing the best he could. "I've got him," he said. "Let's go." The blood that covered Gregory's hands that afternoon wasn't the evidence he'd been bracing for since day one. It was something worse and better simultaneously, proof of how completely he had misread everything and how high the cost of that misreading could have been. We don't always get to know how wrong we were before it's too late. Gregory almost didn't. Gregory drove the way he had driven in exactly one other period of his life, with the focused, narrowed urgency of a man who has reduced the entire world to a single objective and is not processing anything that doesn't serve it. The speed limit was 40. He was not doing 40. Sandra sat in the back with Lily in her lap, and one hand pressed over Gregory's on the center console for approximately 30 seconds before she understood that he didn't need steadying and moved it back to Lily's hair, stroking it in the slow, repetitive way that was as much for herself as for the child. Max was in the cargo space behind them, lying on his side on the moving blanket Gregory had grabbed from the garage without breaking stride. Gregory had folded a towel against the worst of the neck wounds before they'd left the yard, pressing it firm, holding it for the seconds he could spare before getting the dog into the car. And now, the towel was doing the work his hands couldn't do from the driver's seat, and he tried not to think about how dark it had looked when he'd last glanced back at a red light. Max was breathing. He could hear it, shallow and labored and wrong in its rhythm, but continuous, as long as it was continuous. The clinic appeared on the left and Gregory had the car stopped and the cargo door open before Sandra had finished unbuckling Lily from her lap. He gathered Max again. The dog made no sound, no movement, just the passive weight of an animal that had spent everything it had and was now entirely dependent on the people around him. And he carried him through the glass doors of the emergency clinic at something close to a jog. The woman at the front desk read the situation in the first half second. She was already on her feet, already reaching for the phone on the desk, already calling back through the door behind her before Gregory had finished saying the words, "He's bleeding, it's bad, we need." And the double doors to the treatment area swung open and 2 technicians came through them with a gurney. And the transfer happened fast, hands reaching, voices communicating in the clipped shorthand of people trained to move quickly in the presence of damage. Miss Jean came through the doors behind them. She was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped grey hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades being the calmest person in the room during the moments when calm matters most. She took one look at Max on the gurney, at the wounds, at the volume of blood, at the respiratory pattern, and her assessment lasted approximately 4 seconds before she turned to the technicians and said, with complete quiet authority, "Trauma response, room 2, let's move," and then they were gone. The gurney wheels and the double doors and the purposeful controlled urgency of people who know exactly what to do, and the doors swung shut behind them. And the hallway went still. Gregory stood at the center of it for a moment, hands at his sides, and then the motion drained out of him the way it does when the emergency that has been powering you suddenly requires nothing more from your body and your body doesn't know yet what to do with itself. He looked at his hands. They were covered in Max's blood, both of them, palms and fingers and the creases of his knuckles, dried in some places and still tacky in others, the deep reddish brown of blood that has been transferred through contact rather than impact. He had pressed that towel against the wound for the entire drive. He had carried the dog twice. He had not noticed until this moment, standing in a fluorescent hallway with nothing left to do, how completely his hands had been in it. He found the wall with his back and slid down it until he was sitting on the floor, elbows on knees, and looked at his hands and said nothing. Sandra settled beside him without a word. Lily climbed from Sandra's arms into the space between them, and Sandra let her, and the 3 of them sat against the wall of the hallway, while somewhere behind the double doors, people were working on a dog that Gregory had been trying to remove from his home 24 hours ago. "Where's Max?" Lily asked. Her voice in the hallway was very small, not frightened exactly. She had the bewildered, searching quality of a child trying to locate something familiar in an environment that has suddenly stopped making sense. She looked at the double doors. She looked at Gregory. She looked at the doors again. "The doctors are helping him," Sandra said softly. "He got hurt, so the doctors are making him better." Lily considered this, because of the thing in the grass. Gregory looked up from his hands. Sandra's voice stayed even. "Yes, sweetheart, because of the thing in the grass." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then Max made it go away. Neither of them answered that. There was no answer that wouldn't require more than either of them had available right now, so the sentence sat in the hallway and the hallway held it. An older couple entered through the front doors with a small terrier and checked in at the desk in hushed voices. A technician moved past the waiting area with brisk, purposeful steps and disappeared down a side corridor. The fluorescent light above the reception desk had a barely perceptible flicker that Gregory found himself watching for, the way the mind latches onto small irrelevant things when it has been denied its larger object and doesn't know where else to put its attention. Lily asked for Max twice more in the next hour. Each time, Sandra answered in the same quiet way. The doctors were helping him. He was being taken care of. He was going to be okay. And each time, Gregory sat with his elbows on his knees and his blood-covered hands hanging between them and said nothing, because the thing he needed to say wasn't ready yet, and he wasn't sure it would be ready for a long time. He thought about the folder on the kitchen counter, Cole's letter, the sense of what he's protecting and why doesn't switch off. He thought about Max's eyes, finding Lily in Sandra's arms before he went down. He thought about 5 days of watching a dog do nothing threatening, 5 days of patience and positioning and quiet, unasked for devotion. And the conclusion he had drawn from all of it, and what that conclusion had nearly cost the animal currently bleeding in room 2 behind those double doors. Sandra's hand found his arm. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there and left it, and Gregory looked at it, her hand, clean, against his forearm which was not, and felt something crack open in the middle of his chest that he suspected was not going to close again quickly or easily or without leaving a mark. Lily had fallen asleep against Sandra's side, her fingers loose in her lap, her face finally smooth and untroubled in the way it always was when she slept, complete surrender, complete trust, complete safety, the way she'd slept against Max's flank yesterday afternoon. Gregory looked at the double doors. He looked at his hands. He waited. The hardest waiting is the kind you brought on yourself. The kind where the silence gives you nothing to do but sit with every assumption you made, every judgment you rendered, every chance you had to see clearly and chose, instead, to see what you were afraid of. Gregory had 5 days of those. They kept him company in that hallway better than anyone else could have. The double doors opened at 7:43. Gregory knew the time because he had been watching the clock above the reception desk with the fixed, involuntary attention of a person who has run out of other things to look at, tracking the minutes not because they meant anything, but because the mind, deprived of useful work, will find something to measure. 2 hours and 11 minutes since they'd come through the front doors. 2 hours and 11 minutes of fluorescent light, and the soft sounds of a sleeping child, and the particular silence of a marriage sitting together without words, because the words hadn't been invented yet for what they were both carrying. Miss Jean came through alone. She was still in her clinical coat, and she moved into the hallway without hurry, without the brisk urgency of someone delivering a crisis, but without the looseness of someone delivering pure relief either. She carried something in both hands, a shallow metal tray held level, and her face had the composed, careful quality of a person who has decided how to say a difficult thing and is committed to saying it well. She stopped in front of them. Gregory was already on his feet, had come up off the wall the moment the doors moved, the way he'd been coming up off starting blocks his entire adult life, ready before the signal had finished sounding. Sandra stood beside him, Lily half awake and heavy against her shoulder, blinking at the light. "He's stable," Miss Jean said, and those 2 words landed and Gregory took them in and felt the specific physical relief of a man whose body has been braced against an impact and is now carefully standing down. He lost significant blood, and 2 of the wounds required deep closure, but he's stable and his vitals are moving in the right direction. He's sedated. He'll need several days of monitoring before we can talk about recovery timeline, but he's stable. Gregory nodded. His throat was doing something that made speaking complicated. "I want to show you something," Miss Jean said. She adjusted the tray slightly, bringing it level between them. "I want you to see this, because I think you need to understand fully what happened in your yard this afternoon." Gregory looked down at the tray. The coyote was an adult male that was apparent even in death, in the broad skull and the dense, heavy-shouldered build of an animal in its prime. Its grey fur was coarser than it looked from a distance, and it was matted in several places with dried blood from wounds Gregory could identify even without medical training. The throat, the shoulder, the underside lower fought for and won at close range, in the grass, by an animal that had known exactly where to press its advantage. "We brought it in with your dog," Miss Jean said. "It was important to examine it alongside his wounds." She set the tray on the chair beside her and looked at Gregory directly, the way doctors look at you when what they're about to say requires your full attention and they want to make certain they have it. "The bite patterns match. Every wound on your dog corresponds to this animal's dentition. They fought extensively. Your dog sustained every injury in direct contact with this coyote. There is nothing on him that is inconsistent with that fight and nothing that suggests any other cause." Gregory said nothing. "The coyote approached from the tree line," Miss Jean continued, her voice quiet and even unhurried. "Based on the evidence, your dog detected it before it breached the fence, before it was visible, before it was audible to any human in that yard. and then he made a series of decisions. She paused on that word, let it stand for a moment. He didn't vocalize. A dog who barks at a threat in a yard where a small child is playing draws the child toward the sound, toward the danger. Your dog understood, or was trained to understand, that silence was the correct response. He moved to the child first. He put his body between her and the animal's approach, and he removed her from its path by force because there was no time for anything less direct. She let that settle. Then he turned around, she said, and he fought it alone. The hallway was very quiet. Every wound on his body, Miss Jean said, is a wound that was meant for your daughter. He took them in her place, all of them. She looked at Gregory steadily. If that coyote had reached Lily before your dog intercepted it, a coyote that size, in full aggression, Mr. Gregory, we would be having a very different conversation tonight, in a very different part of this building. The last part of that sentence arrived like something physical. Gregory heard it. He understood it in the way you understand things that rearrange the architecture of a moment, not just what was said, but everything beneath it, everything it implied about the 5 days prior, about the folder on the kitchen counter, about the 1-week countdown and the crossed arms in the driveway and the hands that had pulled Max's collar with the full force of a man trying to remove a threat from his daughter. The threat had come from the tree line. It had always been going to come from the tree line. And the only reason his daughter was asleep against Sandra's shoulder right now, unmarked, unharmed, entirely whole, was that he had failed to remove the animal that stood between her and it. His legs went first. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of collapse. It was more like the structural failure of something that has been under load too long and finally, quietly, reaches the limit of what it can bear. His knees found the floor of the hallway, and he was kneeling before he decided to kneel. His hands pressed flat against the cold tile, his head bowed, and the sound that came out of him was not a word, and not a cry, and not anything he could have named, just the sound of a man whose certainty has been completely and irrevocably dismantled, and who has no language yet for what replaces it. Sandra's hands found his shoulders from behind. She didn't say anything. She simply held on, her hands firm and present on either side, steadying without pulling him up, understanding that this was something he needed to go through rather than be lifted out of. Lily stirred against her shoulder and looked down at her father on the floor with the solemn, uncomprehending face of a child witnessing an adult emotion too large to interpret, and she reached down with one small hand and touched the top of his head, the way he touched hers when she was the one who was broken. Miss Jean remained where she was, giving him the room to be undone. After a while, Gregory couldn't have said how long. He pressed his palms against the floor and pushed himself back up. His face was wet. He didn't try to manage that. He stood in the hallway with Sandra's hand on his arm and Lily's fingers still tangled in the back of his collar, and looked at Miss Jean with eyes that were raw and open, and entirely without the guardedness that had been there every other moment of the past 5 days. "Can we see him?" he said. His voice came out stripped and quiet, the voice of a man who has set down something very heavy and isn't certain yet what to do with his empty hands. Miss Jean nodded. "Come with me." Gregory spent 5 days preparing to remove the one thing standing between his daughter and that tree line. His fear wore the costume of protection, and it almost cost Max everything. So right now, if you believe Max deserved better than a 1-week countdown, subscribe to this channel so these stories reach the people who need to hear them. And drop these words in the comments: Max deserved better. Because every dog that bleeds for a child while being called a danger deserves to have someone say it out loud. Don't let Gregory's fear be the last word in this story. The recovery room smelled of antiseptic and warm air, and Max was smaller in it than Gregory had expected. That was the first thought, irrational, he knew, but persistent. The dog that had occupied such enormous space in his mind for 5 days, the animal he had measured and assessed and feared, and ultimately carried bleeding to this building. Lying on the padded table with an IV line in his foreleg and bandaging across his neck and chest, he looked diminished in the way that the injured always do, like something essential has been temporarily withdrawn from them, and the body left behind is only the shell of the thing you knew. Gregory stood at the doorway for a moment, taking that in, and then he walked to the table and put his hand on Max's head. Max's eyes opened. Slowly. With the weighted deliberateness of deep sedation fighting to surface, the amber eyes came open and found Gregory's face. They held there. No reaction, no tail, just the eyes recognizing, present, registering without judgment the face of the man who had spent the better part of a week trying to send him away. Gregory kept his hand on his head and said quietly, "I've got you, you're okay." He came back the next day, and the day after that. He came in the mornings before work and sometimes in the evenings after, and he sat with Max in the recovery room and talked to him in the low, unpracticed way of a man who has not had much experience talking to animals and is discovering that it matters less than he thought whether the words are the right ones. What mattered, he was learning, was the showing up, the being there. The daily evidence of presence that says, without requiring language, you are not forgotten and you are not alone. On the third day, he brought Lily. She walked into the recovery room ahead of him and went directly to Max with the unhesitating certainty of a child who has never doubted where she belongs, and she climbed onto the step stool the technician placed beside the table and leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Max's. Just that, forehead to forehead, her small face and his broad one, the contact held for a long, quiet moment. Her lips moved. Gregory couldn't hear the words, and neither could Sandra, who had stopped in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. Whatever Lily said stayed between her and the dog, whispered into the warm space between them with the privacy of things that don't need witnesses to be true. Max's tail moved. Once, slowly, a single arc, heavy with effort, the tail of an animal working against sedation and wound pain and the sheer exhaustion of a body that has spent everything. But it moved. Lily leaned back and nodded, as though something had been confirmed to her satisfaction, and climbed carefully off the stool. 14 days after he'd been carried through the clinic doors, Max came home. Gregory had spent the previous evening in the garage, which Sandra had noted without commenting on, understanding that he needed to do something with his hands, that the particular guilt he'd been carrying for 2 weeks required a physical form of atonement that words couldn't provide. He'd found dense foam at the hardware store and a heavy canvas cover and a length of non-slip matting for underneath, and he'd built it properly, taking his time, measuring twice, making it the way he made things when they mattered to him, not quickly, not minimally, but right. He placed it outside Lily's door, exactly where Max had always chosen to sleep, not because Gregory had directed him there, not because it was convenient or logical from a household management perspective, but because it was the post Max had selected on the first night, with no instruction and no permission asked, based on his own assessment of where he was most needed. Gregory put the bed in that spot the way you put a name placard on a desk that already belongs to someone, acknowledging what had always been true. Max came through the front door slowly. He would be slow for a while yet, Miss Jean had said, the deep wounds taking their time, and he moved through the house in the quiet, deliberate way that was simply his nature, reacquainting himself with its particular geometry of light and sound and scent. He checked the kitchen. He checked the living room. He checked the back door, standing at it for a moment, looking out at the yard with what Gregory could have sworn was a professional assessment, confirming the perimeter, logging whatever the 2 weeks had changed about it. Then he went upstairs. He found the bed outside Lily's door without being shown it. He stood over it for a moment, and then he turned once and lay down and settled his chin onto his paws with a long, slow exhale that seemed to release something he'd been holding since the clinic, the specific tension of an animal that has been away from its post and is now finally back where it belongs. Gregory stood at the end of the hallway and watched. The light under Lily's door was still on. He could hear her in there, the small sounds of a 4-year-old negotiating her way through the transition from wakefulness to sleep, murmuring to the stuffed animals arranged around her in their nightly configuration. Then the light clicked off. The sounds settled. The house went quiet in its gradual, organic way, room by room, the day releasing its hold. Max's ears softened. Not dropped, not the ears of a dog going off duty, but softened, the fine adjustments of an animal whose environment has returned to a state it recognizes as right. His eyes closed slowly, and his breathing deepened, and he lay in the bed Gregory had built in the place he had always chosen, outside the door he had always guarded, in the house where he had decided, on the first day, that something small and fearless and entirely unprotected needed someone to stand watch. Gregory leaned against the wall in the dark hallway for a long time. He thought about Sergeant Cole's letter. He has a sense of what he's protecting and why. He thought about day one in the driveway, those amber eyes moving across the yard, filing, measuring, and he understood now what Max had been doing in that first minute, not assessing threat, identifying responsibility. Looking at the house and the yard and the small blonde child who had come running without fear, and making, in the quiet and certain way of a creature built for exactly this, a decision that Gregory's subsequent behavior had no power to reverse. Max hadn't seen a family that needed to be convinced of his value. He'd seen a puppy, small, unguarded, moving through the world with the beautiful, reckless confidence of something that had never been hurt, and he had done what every cell in his trained and instinctive and irreducibly loyal body was made to do. He had taken the post. He had held it. Gregory pushed off the wall and walked quietly to Lily's door and stood there a moment, listening to the soft, deep breathing of a child who was safe and whole and entirely unaware of the dimensions of what had nearly happened to her in a backyard on a bright afternoon, or the animal sleeping 18 inches away who had made sure she would never have to know. He crouched down beside Max and put his hand on the dog's broad, bandaged side. Max didn't wake, but his tail moved once in his sleep, slow and certain, like a flag in a quiet wind, and Gregory left his hand there until it stilled. "Good boy," he said quietly, to the dark, to the dog, to whatever part of himself was finally, at great cost and too late and not too late, listening. He meant it the way you mean the things you should have said days ago and are only now finding the language for, completely and without reservation, and with the full weight of everything it had taken to get here. Max didn't wait to be trusted before he protected her. He didn't require belief in order to act. He simply did what he was made to do, and he did it whether Gregory deserved it or not. That is the nature of genuine loyalty. It doesn't ask whether you've earned it. It just holds the line and hopes, eventually, you'll understand why. Gregory spent 5 days trying to remove the one thing standing between his daughter and that tree line, and he almost succeeded, all because protection didn't look the way he expected it to. So tell us honestly, would you have made the same call, or would you have trusted Max from day one? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that the guardian at the door doesn't always look the way we pictured. Sometimes it has 4 legs, amber eyes, and more loyalty than we ever thought to deserve.